farmer. This is episode 37 of Uncommon Conversations. My guest today is Karl Emmrich. I hope I'm saying his name correctly. I talked to him on a I talked to him on a TikTok live not that long ago, and we had a really good conversation. We disagreed on a whole bunch, but I was actually able to come and bring some reasonable conversation to him. What's up, Karl? Just go ahead and request to join in the little things down there at the bottom, and I'll let you in, and then we'll get after it. But yeah, we had a really good conversation the other night on TikTok, and afterwards we sort of connected and decided to do this. And hello, sir.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
All right, awesome.
Cool. So how you been, man? What have you been up to?
I've been good. No, nothing too crazy. I'm excited for this conversation. What about you?
Yeah, nothing much. Fed my cat. I was on a live earlier for maybe 20 minutes or something. Got to talk about global warming and reparations. So those were some cool topics to hit on randomly with a guy. And, this sort of seems to be the theme with me, where we have very civil discourse and everyone's like, whoa.
That's good then.
Trying to keep the theme going here. So if you would please, I'm really interested. What has been your political journey? Sort of where are you at now? And what are your thoughts on the Republicans, the Democrats, and then sort of Trump, vaguely?
Yeah, definitely. So I actually originally started, I guess, my first political stuff that I was involved in, a little more like libertarian leaning, but it wasn't from like an economic libertarian thing. It was more like anti-war, and I was very pro drug legalization and stuff like that. And so from there I was like, oh, I guess libertarian is the best place to be. But then from there, I lived in Norway for a little bit, just like 4 months. I was very involved with the 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign. And that was kind of showed me, oh, well, you can be, anti-war, pro things like drug legalization, and then also support things like Medicare for all and things that I found to be more important. And then from there, definitely one of the figures that I find a lot of inspiration in and just a lot of knowledge from is Noam Chomsky. I find him to be just very informative on a lot of different issues. And then currently in U.S. Congress, to get an idea of where my politics are, Bernie Sanders in the Senate and Ilhan Omar in the House are probably the two closest to where I am politically.
Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, it kind of is interesting how we might get into politics for certain reasons, and then as you discover sort of the nuances of it, you're like, oh, I didn't realize these people were in favor of this, and you can kind of figure out your place in it all. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on Ilhan Omar specifically.
Okay.
Just because my limited exposure to her has not. I haven't gotten a lot of substance from her positions. I feel like, just personally, I haven't really felt like I've been fed anything of note, so I don't pay attention to her too much. So I'm sort of speaking out of ignorance, but that's just because, you get the wrong sort of first introduction to somebody. You kind of put them in their category, and there's an endless number of things to look into. So I'm definitely interested in that. And I think it's really cool you worked in the 2016 Bernie campaign. I don't know if we said this on the live the other day, but I voted for him in the primaries of 2016. I switched to the Democrat Party just to do that because of his commentary on Hillary Clinton taking massive fees from banks for doing secret speeches behind closed doors and all sorts of sketchy stuff. And it just seemed like he was advocating for things that really mattered for the people. She was a corrupt sellout, and generally speaking, I'm sort of I'll gamble a little bit for the sake of someone better. So even though he would have been a risk and a change, and especially with the president being in the position of the president, not necessarily in Congress, his foreign policy and other sort of more complicated things would come to bear more. So it would have been interesting, but I supported him, and then I saw him get completely cut out of the Democrat Party. I saw that whole machine screw him over not once but twice. And then maybe in 2020 it was sort of more open strategic stuff. In 2016 it was like behind closed doors, the DNC on their internal stuff, and um, unfortunately that really tainted me to the Democrat Party a little bit because they did not let there be a fair democratic process in that thing. So it made me see that, and then I saw on the Republican side they let Trump through, regardless of your opinions on Trump. They let the populist, the sort of will of the people guy that was a maverick and an outsider in, and that definitely earned some points for me in terms of the Republican Party being more suitable for change, more suitable for certain things like that. But um, I don't know. These broader issues are a little bit more complicated than that. But yeah, that was sort of my take with that. And then with the 2020 cycle with Bernie, um, I had already felt the burn and then gotten burned. So by the time 2020 came around, I was sort of not interested in him as a candidate because what ended up happening was kind of what I expected to happen. Like there'd be questionable calls, questionable rules. There would be strategic plays by the field to cut him out and not give him a fair one-on-one shot with with Biden. There's lots of other progressive candidates that stayed in, whereas more centrist, behind the Biden machine guys dropped out, so that you shifted some votes but kept some votes away from Bernie. So I didn't like that, but that's politics also, and it's not the end of the world. Um, but yeah, that's sort of been my take on those things. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about Ilhan Omar,
Yeah.
and
Well,
yeah.
so the first thing I want to clarify is I did not have the privilege of working for Bernie in 2016. I just meant I was involved like in paying attention to his campaign, and I just got a lot of excitement from it. I did do door knocking and canvassing in 2020 for his campaign, but I've never like been paid by the campaign or anything like that.
Okay, gotcha.
But yeah, so on the Ilhan Omar side, I feel like it's so unfortunate because I feel like she's someone that has been just relentlessly smeared. I feel like that she's constantly taken out of context. She's constantly misconstrued, and I think that we've seen some. I don't know if we'd agree on this. To me, it's very, very evident. She has been the victim of so much Islamophobia and just outright bigoted attacks, in my opinion. I think that you've seen that, especially with people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, now like someone that's supposed to be her peer in Congress, that was referring to Ilhan Omar's election as an invasion. Um, I think that Ilhan Omar has been just very misconstrued. But in terms of foreign policy, I mean, I can't think. Maybe you could say like Rashida Tlaib, but I can't think of someone that's just more on the nose with the things that matter. I mean, she's one of the leading voices in talking about Yemen and what's going on there and the Saudi-led atrocities in Yemen. She's one of the leading voices in talking about Palestinian rights. I just think, I mean, you can just go down the list. I mean, I think that she had a solid take
I
on Afghanistan. She's not perfect by any means, but I think that of like the current state of Congress, she's pretty good.
It was interesting. I am so I've been working on a book, and one of the intro sections to it is that the reason why I'm a moderate is because you have to acknowledge that great points, great arguments, and great value, I guess, can come from any political side. You don't know where it's going to come from, and as someone who had my particular economic and other sorts of associations and beliefs, AOC and the squad, and so Ilhan Omar as an extension was never really would be someone that I would, in general be an ally in. Again, in terms of broader goals, maybe, but in terms of policy, definitely lots of disagreements. But I specifically said Ilhan Omar was the only person in our government that called out the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims in China. She was the first person to sort of cross that board, and I said I have to give her credit for that. I have to say that takes balls, courage, ovaries, whatever whatever you want to say. It takes stuff to be able to do that and to break that kind of ground, and she helped open up that conversation. So I didn't know about those other things you mentioned, but I definitely have seen that in her, that she's willing to sort of speak to things that the rest aren't. And yeah, so I'll try to give my my summary of the dirt on her to give you a sense of sort of what I have been led to believe and what there are questions of. Now, on the policy front, it's pretty much just been standard healthcare differences or sort of stuff like that would be the thing. But there was some, and this is just sort of a shit talking rumor about her possibly having married her own brother in order to get him legally to the United States, which you could have your own debate about sort of, you just do what you got to do to get someone into office. And I wouldn't even know what that would say about her character. If she was in love with and dating and procreating with her brother, then, there's a different debate there to be had. But there's that. There was
Well,
her
just
sort
to
of
take them
dismissive.
one at a time, though. That
Oh,
has
yeah.
been the idea that she married her brother has been debunked a number of times.
Okay.
She didn't
There
marry
was
her
nothing
brother.
like that.
It's really I think that just to go into it, I think that one of the reasons that I guess rumor has been able to go so far is that people are able to just say sometimes whatever they want about her. And I think because of a lot of sometimes I'm not saying this about you necessarily, but just people have some I think very bigoted assumptions about people like Ilhan Omar, and they'll believe these like things that she married her brother, and then sometimes people will say this, oh well, she did it for like immigration, but I feel like the connotation that people are getting at when they say, oh, she married her brother, is they're trying to say that, oh, she was dating her brother, or was in love with her brother. But I mean, it's not it wasn't it's not true. But yeah, go on.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that was the underlying concern there. Yeah, there's definitely you could say it's, related to religion, or you could say it's related to race, or you could say it's related to sort of a mixed understanding of Somalia, and also sort of certain cultures, and how that is more permissible in some cultures, not very many, but some. So I think I think because there's a constant sort of defending accusations of racism and accusing of racism, I'm sort of always on the side of trying to look for alternative explanations as well. Not necessarily because, like, if you listen to someone, sometimes you can really tell, and it depends on the details of what they say. But
I mean,
I
I
think it's
think
just because of the volatility of that particular cycle of constantly having to defend, constantly sort of accusing, and what it does to our discourse. I try to, but I mean, in that same vein, that kind of a rumor spreading is terrible for the discourse as well. So,
well, I think
there's politics, I guess.
it's one of those things where like I can't imagine any Republican politician where like a claim like that could be made and people wouldn't like expect some like evidence or something like that. I mean, you could imagine someone saying like, "Oh, Ted Cruz married his sister," and people saying, "Well, is there any proof of that?" And then
If it
it
was
not
someone
going
from
any far.
Alabama, I think that rumor would
I
work.
mean, I definitely, I think no, I get what you're saying. You know what I mean, though. But I think a lot of it has to do with Ilhan Omar came here as a refugee, and so I think that there's just this. I guess people have lower standards with what they're willing to believe about her. At least that's my take on it, and I think it's really unfortunate because I think she's really good.
I think right wingers have a low standard for what they'll believe of left wingers, and left wingers have a low standard for what they'll believe of right wingers, and
Yeah.
it's different content, like racism versus um, this sort of question of, is wanting to take welfare programs sort of selfish in a certain sense, or entitlement. They're not necessarily the same content of criticisms, but that's sort of a thing where you're willing to assume the worst in the other side and the best in your side is kind of one of the defects of politics, because we got to just hold each other accountable on our side, on the other side. And, I am trying to advocate for we are Americans first. We will succeed or fail first in that way. And then the rest is sort of, we agree on common sense policies, good economy, low crime, cheap cost of living, etc. But it's a question of sort of how. Even the healthcare thing, I think everyone agrees poor people should get access to healthcare and they shouldn't be prevented from getting access to healthcare. It's just a question of, do you think the free market is the best way to create the cheapest products and stuff to make that happen? Or if poverty is sort of this eternal thing, do you need to have the government step in to give that to people because healthcare goods and services are so critical, they literally are relevant to your life, that they mean more than just economics. So you need this sort of, in my opinion, an extension of valuing life and human life inherently. Do you need this sort of different approach to the healthcare industry? And then on the Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, no lives matter, whole thing. If you just said, do you think police should be allowed to abuse citizens? And then the second is, if they do that, do you think they should be held accountable? I've not come across anyone that disagrees with those 2 points. Not a soul. It's always a question of, well, what do you mean? Then we get into qualified immunity and sort of under the hood stuff. But there are many of these scenarios where there's an assumption of disagreement on goals and character assassination or intelligence assassination sort of comes with that. And that I don't know, that hasn't been my experience, but there are morons and racists and all that kind of stuff out there. So it's not like it's you'll always have material if you're looking for that kind of stuff, and if you're looking for the opposite, I think you'll find more material. But um, anywho, moving on. This again was sort of this is just one of those gotcha political things.
Hmm.
And so even as I'm saying it, I never really took it seriously, but she was sort of, I think, in the name of saying that we've done evil stuff to other countries and other organizations have done evil stuff to us. She said 9/11 was sort of a thing that just happened, and she was a little dismissive of it. And that is strictly a feelings and interpretation and connotation issue. It's not like I would assume she's against terrorism. This seems like a self-evident kind of a thing. So it's not like there's any serious undergirding. Well, if it's Islamic terror, it's not that bad. I don't think that was where she was coming from, but that sort of, I think that is kind of the end of my real detailed exposure to her outside of standard progressive member of the squad. So I kind of know what they all stand for, a Green New Deal of some sort, healthcare for all, living wage type of considerations, and the useless wars, um, pro-choice, and then maybe probably one other thing, maybe more in favor of immigration than the rest. But beyond that, I don't really know much about her. But
Yeah.
that's sort of what I've been exposed to.
Yeah, of course. Well, just to get into, I guess I think what you were referring to is the because some people did something statement about
Yeah,
9/11. I think that yeah, that's a good example of one that I think was really just I guess taken out of proportion, and I think I guess taken out of context. The context of what she was saying is that you had a whole group of people that were demonized in the U.S. because of a tragedy. And if you watch the whole thing, she definitely refers to 9/11 as a tragedy, and it also it just goes into. I mean, she
but she was
talks
just
about
saying because it's some people, meaning a minority of the population or a minority of this
well, yeah,
demographic,
just because these,
did this thing, but it's
these
not. They're
people
all.
did it, it's been, yeah. But I was going to say that she has been asked, she talks about this one time, she's been asked to condemn Al Qaeda like dozens of times. And I don't think any other member of Congress has been asked that. And the only reason she is asked to do that is because she's Muslim. And I think that that's like a very clear, like, no one would ever ask, John Kasich, do you condemn, he's not in Congress, but you know what I mean? No one would ask, anyone else. No one's ever asked Nancy Pelosi, do you condemn Al Qaeda? And I think that she has this like stigma attached to her just inherently because she is
I've seen a lot of that with the Jewish community in Israel. A lot of what are your allegiances, what are your ties, and that largely has kind of gone the other direction because obviously Democrats are mostly pro-Palestine, not anti-Israel, the existence of Israel, but I think anti their occupation of certain territories and um, anti bullying. I don't know if we talked about this on the stream the other night, but sort of against the excessive force that is used by them compared to the other side. So
I don't even
I've
think
seen
it's the
some of that
majority of
anti-Israeli, anti-Jewish stuff the other way, but I agree with you. So I agree with you that she is only being asked that question because of her friendliness, understandable friendliness, and then also because of her being a Muslim as well. But yeah.
yeah. I mean, I don't know what you mean by friendliness, but like friendliness to who?
She's more of a vocal ally for that community than everyone else, both because of her political stances and because she's Muslim. Like, I expect a Muslim to be a better advocate for Muslims than Christians in general, just because of the personal experience and stuff like that. So because she has those signals of friendliness in the direction where other people would say, oh, because we're always picking up on these, no one's direct in politics for the most part. We're always picking up on these subtle cues and trying to interpret, what this means and that means, and reading people's minds, and so that's sort of what I meant, though, that she's literally and in a true sense been an ally and a friend to that community in a way maybe others haven't, like with the China thing. And so there's this like automatic like, oh, and no, there was one other thing. She wrote a letter. I don't know if you've heard about this. She wrote a letter um, asking for sort of uh, compassion for some young Muslim men here, I think it was in Minnesota, that had reached out and tried to become a part of a terrorist group
Yeah.
overseas, and they were being prosecuted for that. And then um, this is strictly like just association in my head. I'm pretty sure she also said, was tying that into sort of they're only getting this hatred or this treatment because of racism or because of Islamophobia, as opposed to because they were trying to get, tied in with a criminal organization, which I think we should be more strict on that. I think, if you want to be a part of a gang, it's, maybe we should start asking questions about you. Like, I think we should be a little bit more on the ball with that stuff. It shouldn't just be like, well, you just have an interest in this group and it doesn't mean anything. But I don't know, maybe that gets out of hand because then you start talking about Antifa and like what is friendliness to Antifa, and then you get talking about the Proud Boys and what is friendliness to the Proud Boys. So now that I've sort of said it out loud, I feel like there's no way to sort of handle that more broadly. But getting back to the thing, I think she did have a letter where she wrote to the district attorney or a judge asking them to be a little bit more deferential to those people because of their poverty or whatever their background was. Um, it was more okay for them to have tried to join that group. But I don't know if have you heard about that? Do you
I
know about that?
I honestly don't. So I don't want to speak on it, you know what I mean? Just because,
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with the context. I do think yeah, I definitely, I don't want I don't want us to talk too much about Ilhan Omar. Yeah, so I guess beyond there, maybe you want to talk a little bit about your transition from Bernie supporter, a Bernie
Yeah.
supporter to a degree, to a Trump supporter, because like, or would you say that that's a fair characterization or no?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
more of just
Yeah.
okay, yeah. Like, because for me, I always view the two as pretty diametrically opposed on most issues. And so I'm really fascinated by this transition. But don't get me wrong, I know that it exists. There's people like that, and I think part of it comes from after in 2016 and in 2020. Trump both times was like, "Oh, the Democratic Party robbed Bernie," and like I definitely think he did that to try to appeal to Bernie voters that were disillusioned, and maybe not necessarily thinking that they would come over to him, but thinking, "Oh, maybe they just won't vote." You know what I mean? And so I definitely think that he played that in an intelligent way, trying to appeal to something, a clear problem. So yeah, I'm interested about that transition. I guess. Were there any policies that you felt like there were overlap between the two?
Yeah. So I did not know very much about Bernie Sanders' immigration stances at that point. Um, but on trade, I heard him talking a lot about how our trade deals were hurting the working class in America. And upon hearing that enough, and then hearing Trump echo some of the same points, and then I listened to Trump, and he had been talking about trade for a very long time. It made me take a second look at that. But I should get before that. I should clarify a couple of things. I started off in a Republican household, and then sort of transitioned to libertarian in 2012, 2013, and then by the time Bernie came around, it was much more because of his by the time Bernie came around, I had learned enough about the corruption in politics to have had a panic attack about it. And literally, and for 18 months, I stopped paying attention to politics. And a friend of mine from college actually sent me the link to Bernie Sanders' interview on Stephen Colbert in 2015. And that sort of got me plugged back in because I was like, okay, this seems like a guy who's got a heart, who cares about the corruption, who cares about serving the people. And so by that time, being a libertarian and recognizing the corruption in our institutions, even at that stage, let alone now, um, I was very much sort of anti-establishment, pro someone showing up to fight for the people. And I didn't see too much of that from the inside. So Trump being an outside Republican, so I'm very familiar with Republican views because I grew up in that household and I've been studying this stuff for a while. So I knew, first off, Trump was breaking lots of rules in terms of the standard Republican narrative, talking about trade deals and negotiating international commerce as the government is totally anti sort of the free market concept. On the right, it's free market and free trade must be the same thing, ergo we should have free trade, and that's a mistaken logic on their part. But so uh, he was willing to break barriers and sort of have a unique voice. He said, and now I kind of realize, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but now I sort of realize that the phrase audit the Fed is kind of a nothing phrase because Congress can kind of always control and choose what they do, change the policies, the target inflation rate and all that kind of stuff, how they calculate inflation, what interest rates, because it says that one of the mandates for the Federal Reserve is keeping moderate interest rates, which is totally up to interpretation about what
Right.
that actually means. So, and we already know what the Federal Reserve owns to back the currency. So, and it's a lot of mortgage stuff and real estate. So, the term audit the Fed now I can recognize as sort of an empty thing. But at the time when Trump said, we're going to audit the Fed, I was like, oh, he's saying the thing no one else is saying. And so that plus some of the other stuff. And also, and this is really interesting. I dealt with moderate levels of wealth until I was about 5 or 6 years old. And then my parents got married and my dad inherited, not from his parents, but from his boss, got to take over a 6-figure plus profit business.
Wow.
And so from 6 to 8 years old, we were really, really well off. And I don't know if you were a fan of Yu-Gi-Oh back in the day,
I was
but when we
actually.
were, okay, so we were on a random little trip in North Carolina to see my great grandmother, and I got $100 to spend on whatever I wanted, and I bought Exodia, the full 5-set
Oh,
piece,
that's really
because I
cool.
saw that and I was like, dude, this is awesome. And so I did that. So we had that kind of money where a 7-year-old could just get $100 and like we didn't feel a thing. Within 2 years, there was no food in the home, and we were connected by an extension cord to the neighbor's house to keep our fridge and our TV going.
Wow.
Because my dad had just destroyed the business. So
Yeah.
by that time, 8, 9 years old, I felt real poverty and like felt that giant crash. And so when I was around that time and we had an essay about who you could have lunch with, the only rich person I knew was Donald Trump. So I said, I want to have a lunch with Donald Trump because he's rich and I want to figure out how to be rich so that I don't have to deal with the shit I just dealt with in my family. And so he was in my like zeitgeist, so to speak, or sort of in my periphery for a long time. And someone who had made their own money, didn't need money, couldn't get bought out in politics, and someone that had competence and real leadership and like making shit happen, where in the government you're kind of getting money to do stuff, whereas in the private sector you have to go convince people to give you money so that you can do stuff and so that you can keep your businesses going. And so there was this respect for the competence of a real capitalist, as well as a desperation for someone outside the system. And so when Trump came along, he was sort of the plug in the hole that fit perfectly in terms of what I was hoping would show up. And then it was a question of Hillary Clinton, which is a guaranteed shit sandwich of corruption, or Trump, which is a gamble, 5% chance he's Hitler, 45% chance he just shakes things up, another 45%, 50% chance he just doesn't do anything, was kind of how I was feeling about it, that he would just kind of be a showman and a shill and what a lot of people thought he was.
Well, let me hear, which of those do you feel like he ended up being? Or not to cut you off, but I'm interested then, of that breakdown, where do you think he ended up leaning more towards?
So I would definitely say he overperformed in my so now that he's out of office, we can have a more level-headed conversation about him. So I'm starting to learn things about his presidency that were kept buried through all of the headline stuff and all of the policy shifts and all the events. So there's been a few things that were more in the dictator sort of a direction than I was expecting that I'm learning now. But I knew he had a bulldozing strongman personality because he is a highly successful businessman. And even if you're a quiet person or an alpha male, loudmouth or whatever you want to call it, like him, even if you want to say he was faking it and just putting on a show, there is that sort of forcing it and finding every avenue for success aspect to those sort of, I call them psycho-capitalists, that are at the very, very top of that hierarchy. And so I saw some of those tendencies in him, but because it's the American system, because we have checks and balances, and he couldn't violate the law, he didn't have freedom to just control us any which way he wanted, I wasn't as concerned. with those things. Now, ultimately, his resume of accomplishment, as well as the obvious threat that the system felt he was, um, plus just a bunch of sort of stuff that he brought up that we needed to start talking about, like China. We weren't talking about China at all 5, 6 years ago, and now, we're sort of much more awake to how much they've bought out our politicians, how involved in our politics and our political system they are. We're much more aware of their geopolitical threats, their deal making in Africa. Like, there's just a lot that sort of come to the forefront that wasn't there before. But one major pivoting point was, first off, I thought he had a chance of winning, so I wasn't shocked when he did win in 2016. And I saw everyone get flabbergasted, and I was like, oh, okay, well, you guys weren't seeing what I was seeing. That's okay.
Yeah.
You guys don't know the Republican Party the way I do. I literally, when I looked at everyone in the primaries on both sides, it was Hillary, Bernie, and then that military dude. And I knew that
Martin
military
O'Malley.
dude wasn't going to be there for 5 seconds. So, and then I check this out. I legit looked down the whole line of everyone in the Republican Party: Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Chris Christie, all these guys, and Trump. And I know the Republican Party, and I know it was Trump versus a bunch of nerds, and Trump would win. And that's what happened. Like, I literally spent 15 seconds paying attention on the primary side with Trump in terms of like how the debates and all those kinds of things went, because I knew how it would go ahead of time. Like, I plugged into some stuff, but I also was kind of more paying attention to the Bernie Hillary Clinton stuff because I just found that more interesting. I kind of knew the writing on the wall on the Republican side. So until the general election, I didn't give Trump my full attention and didn't start going back deep into what he had to say. Anywho, I sort of lost. Yeah, I kind of lost my train of thought there. If you could help me find it again, that'd be
No,
great.
that's okay. Well, I think originally I think you were going to say how you felt like Trump lived up to the expectations you had for him. But you did kind of touch on that. And then I guess you were saying just where your estimation of how well he thought he would do going into the election.
Oh, I remember where I was. When Trump said that Obama was wiretapping him, that created a huge deviation in the narrative where either he was or he wasn't. Either there was some surveillance of the Trump campaign or there was not. And it turned out to be that there was surveillance of the Trump campaign through proxies and things like that. But, if you're getting that close to investigating a political candidate in an election year, like, that's dirty enough, in my opinion, especially as it came out, the Russian dossier and that documentation was brought together by John McCain and members of the Republican Party, the Hillary Clinton campaign, and I think Fusion GPS was the legal firm that sort of did all this. They went to Christopher Steele, who was a British spy, and then he went to Russia and collected evidence, which was probably Russian misinformation, about Trump peeing in the hotels and that sort of whole thing. And then it got put out into the media, and then the FBI started investigating it. And then we got 3 years of a Russia collusion investigation that was against the president of the United States, the government investigating our own elected representative. And it came up with nothing, by my understanding. Like, there was no concrete ties, no concrete, coordination. And on the policy side, Trump started funding Ukraine and Ukrainian military, or started giving Ukraine
That was
military
the most
assistance.
bizarre thing. I mean, he pulled out of like the INF treaty. I mean, it was arguably more entire. I mean, the bombing of like Syria, which was like proxies of Russia. Yeah, it's almost arguably you could say it was more antagonistic towards Russia, which I view as a bad thing though. And so I want to. So you had a lot to say there. I want to tackle some of it. First, I definitely I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I definitely disagree with the characterization of Trump as someone this like self-made billionaire. You know what I mean? He definitely. I mean, what was the original quote? He got a small loan from his dad of $1 million.
Well, yeah,
I definitely
he's successful because of his dad, and he's successful because his dad got rich off of the public dole. They originally got rich because they started plugging into government contracts, government deals, and they've been doing business with the government and were a part of the swamp since the 1920s. So, yeah, it's not so much that he was a self-made man, so much as that he was a he had shown himself to be a successful leader at the top of a giant organization as the chief decision maker of the organization. And that to me is the primary skill set of a governor, a mayor, a president. They need to be able to operate in that sort of executive decision making capacity. So that's more,
I
but I know what you're talking about, and I agree. He's not. Trump has oversold himself like a shitty car salesman from from 1882 till now. He's been doing it for forever. So I think, yeah, so I agree with you that characterization of him as a self-made man, or this guy who, against all odds was able to succeed. I think that is a false representation of him.
Yeah, but then I guess even from there, and I will give credence to Trump did say stuff during the primaries that was a break from traditional Republican orthodoxy. He said stuff about trade that was different. He said during one of the debates, he said like, "Oh, like the towers fell under George Bush," like a pretty big, condemnation of George Bush. He
Yeah,
had a lot of
he
things.
went he went full ham hock against Bush, which was obviously a big no-no for most Republicans. They're all like, "No, he was a great president."
Yeah, it was definitely. I mean, obviously, I'm sure it had a large part to do with Jeb Bush being on the stage. But
For
you know what I
sure,
mean.
for
Like
sure.
there was a
No,
huge
for sure, one
well,
hundred percent.
and it was also interesting because like I feel like you touched on it. Like the Republicans had set up this for years, for decades prior. They've talked about how like, oh, people that are really wealthy, that means that they're very competent. And so when someone comes in that's a billionaire like Donald Trump, well then by the own things that they've said before, well then I guess Trump would be the most competent. You know what I mean? And I think that, but I guess I've always disagreed with this characterization of Trump as an outsider. And I feel like we touched on it in our conversation, but I feel like you have to look no farther than his cabinet once he got into office to show that he was not an outsider by any stretch of the imagination. Not on the imperialism side. John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, those are not outsiders. He's putting them in his administration. Rex Tillerson, what's that guy's name? Steve Mnuchin, Mark Esper, like all non-outsider people. And so like I feel like if even himself, I mean, a billionaire that bragged about donating to politicians, I feel like that's not an outsider. You know what I mean? That is someone deeply ingrained in the swamp. You know what I mean? Like, that wasn't really a term beforehand. But like, if we're going to say there's a swamp, I feel like you can't separate Trump from that swamp. And then to go even further than that, I think that once Trump got into office, while he did have some rhetorical flares that were different than Republicans, his actual policy and governance was as traditional Republican as you can expect, other than some stuff regarding like tariffs. I think for the most part, almost everything else he did was like basically what you would expect. But I'm sure you disagree with a lot of that, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, it's interestingly enough. I'll start with the last thing you said. I don't disagree with that, but that's the I don't disagree that a lot of what he ended up doing was traditional Republican or conservative policy making, like cutting the corporate income tax rate. But where I disagree is that I thought those were good policy. I thought that they actually, like, because I'm in my
And
position,
we should go back to
especially
those. We should
yeah,
go back to that.
especially economically, I do agree with a lot of Republican economic points, not their dismissal of sort of the woes of the poor people, or I believe the system is rigged against poor people in favor of rich people in a multitude of ways I can articulate. But in terms of like having economic literacy, understanding how the economy works, understanding, you know, a lot of the fundamentals, so to speak, of economic thinking that the Republicans advocate for, like the basics work in any sort of domain of competition. The basics are, the fundamentals, whatever you want to call them, like they are pretty solid. Um, and so I advocated for some of those things. What I'm trying to go back to what you said.
His cabinet. I'd love to hear your
Oh
response to
no,
his
yeah, you're
cabinet
talking about insider versus
or
outsider.
his
So
administration. Yeah.
so he definitely had almost exclusively people, except for maybe Steve Mnuchin, because I think he was just in Goldman Sachs before he came in. I don't think he actually worked for the government or as a lobbyist before that, but I
Uh,
don't know.
it was Goldman Sachs, but I would consider Goldman Sachs to be fairly establishment. I mean, wouldn't you?
They're the buyers of the power, so yeah, they're very much, yeah, pro establishment. So where I would say he was an outsider, and where I would say where that is decided for me is more so the policy decisions, and where he deviated from what others in the establishment would have wanted him to do
But
or say.
but but I thought we just agreed that he didn't really break from Republican orthodoxy.
So on some economic policies, he did stick with Republican stuff, But like I said, well, I already said like on the tariff thing. I want to take for a sec. I want to take a second to think of some better examples, but um, uh, he um,
Because even with trade, not to interrupt your train of thought, I mean, like,
oh,
you know, he got rid of
gay
NAFTA.
marriage. Gay marriage is another one. He came into office advocating for gay marriage, and that was the first president ever to come into office doing that. And then obviously Obama had
I
switched
want to
midterm.
I agree that Trump, I guess, if his rhetoric was, you could say, pro gay marriage, but on the platform that he ran on, both in 2016 and 2020, they were both in opposition to gay marriage. Like in the Republican Party platform that he ran on in 2016 and 2020. Now they just reused the same platform for 2020 that they used in 2016. But both were opposed to gay marriage. And so like I push back, like you know, you can definitely say like he was pro gay marriage, you know, he didn't like openly talk about being against it, you know, not like George Bush. George wanted a constitutional amendment against it.
Mhm.
But like when he doesn't, like when he cares so little about it that he didn't like try to get that removed from the platform, I push back on like whether or not it's fair to say that he's like pro gay marriage. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, he definitely didn't. It wasn't something close to his heart. The people that the people that I've heard reference what he said behind closed doors, has said his opinion. Literally, what he said is, "I don't give a shit. I don't think anyone's given a shit for like 20 years about gay marriage." So that's the only thing I've heard, sort of
I would
outside of
agree.
what
He
he said
probably
on
doesn't care.
TV.
I would
And
agree. He
so, yeah,
probably doesn't care.
I think largely what Trump cared about was foreign policy and economics, and I think the rest was whatever sort of whatever not even whatever he had to believe in, maybe whatever he had to believe in, but also just sort of he wasn't as invested in those things, both because he didn't understand them and because as president, he didn't necessarily have as much power over those things. One of the things that I noticed under Obama and then I noticed under Trump, and I guarantee will be brought up again under Biden, is they didn't get enough laws passed when that's Congress's job, not the
Yeah,
president's job.
I
And
definitely
so
don't remember hearing that criticism of Trump, if I'm being honest.
So that was just a personal friend of mine who
Yeah.
said he did a lot on the regulatory stuff, but he didn't get a lot of laws passed, and so that just sort of got me on that train of thinking. But I agree that was hardly the biggest
Yeah,
concern for
exactly.
many
Yeah.
people, and on his and I'm not gonna lie, he he made me sick to my stomach at points, like in an like attempting to be an advocate for him or attempting to even just try to see the good sides of what I thought he was doing. Um, he made me sick to my stomach sometimes. Like he retweeted someone that was on a little golf cart going across a little thing that
Oh,
yelled out
I
"white
remember that.
power"
Yeah, I
and then
remember that.
deleted it real quickly. And I literally almost threw up that day because for whatever 18 months up until that point, I had been like, well, he said this, but I think he's an asshole, not a racist. Well, I said this, but I think he's an asshole, not a racist, because of this the accusation defending thing. And then he shared that, and I was just like,
Yeah.
and then he deleted it, and then um, uh, interestingly enough, going into the 2020 election, before in the primaries, I was for Andrew Yang and maybe even Tulsi Gabbard as a choice before Trump, but unfortunately, like they both, like neither of them really made it in. I think
Yeah.
Tulsi sort of shot herself in the foot. She would only talk about the endless wars, and you just can't bring a lot of people together if you seem one dimensional like that.
Yeah.
And I think that's my only criticism of her, was not her views, but her promotion of her views and her overemphasis on one issue. And then Andrew Yang was literally, and now he's shifted. He's no longer officially a Democrat. He's sort of coming back to more of an independent way of thinking, but
Yeah.
he got screwed
What's his?
over
He has a new
objectively by the
party.
establishment.
What's his new party called? He started like a new party, didn't he?
I don't know if he started a new party, but I think you're right. I haven't looked into it. I don't really
Me
know,
neither.
so I can't speak to it. But what I will say is like MSNBC, when he was polling at 8 or 9%, and Kamala was at 1%, Elizabeth Warren was at 3%. At times, they wouldn't even put him on the list. He wasn't even on the
Oh,
list.
I
They would
remember
just
that being a
leave him
thing.
off. So when that happens and you're too cowardly to speak up, and just call it out for what it is, which even if you want to say it's strategic, it's still, to me, being too strategic in that kind of a situation. Sometimes you just got to bite the bullet and speak the truth and say this is bullshit, um, because it matters. If MSNBC does that to candidates, it matters forever. It's
Yeah.
not sort of just a him thing. It's a systemic issue that they do that at all. So I really wish he had spoken up more about it. And when that happened, I started to pull back my support of him. But once he dropped out and he wasn't going to have a shot, and it was Trump versus Biden. It was an easier call for me there to just go with Trump because one, his shit stain on the country was kind of already, there. Like it wasn't going to get a whole lot worse. He kind of had done the damage that he was going to do. And I felt like there were lots of things going in good directions. I talked to you about the Abraham Accords and just sort of economic deals between Muslim countries. And I think, right, we talked about that?
I think
Economic
we
deals between Muslim countries and
I think we
Israel.
touched on them. Yeah, I think we did.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to go back into that, or like I guess I don't know which direction you want
I
to
was
go.
I was just sort of making the broader point that because in whatever September, October, November of 2020, uh, tensions slash movement with Iran, I felt like was going in a good direction. If Trump got reelected, we would get sort of a renewed pressure from them to sort of come to terms with the Trump administration.
I definitely got to
We
push
would have gotten
back
more
on. I got to push back on that. I think that there was a
okay.
lot of tension between the U.S. and Iran. I mean, it wasn't like late 2020. Trump had literally increased sanctions on Iran again. There was that Iranian nuclear scientist that was assassinated, and I don't think that's been directly tied to the U.S. I think more people think that it was
I think that
maybe.
was the Israelis.
I
I
think
think that
people
was
think
Israel.
Israel did it like maybe with the the okay from the U.S. or something like that.
I'm pretty sure
Um,
Netanyahu, pretty sure Benji
yeah,
um, said, like, wink wink,
yeah.
happy he's gone.
Yeah,
I don't
they
remember what it
definitely
was,
they
but I
definitely
remember a
endorsed it.
signaling saying they're like, we'll take credit, thank you.
Yeah, exactly. But so like I would definitely disagree that tensions with Iran were at a lower point. I mean, you could argue that like they were higher than they'd ever been. I think. I mean, maybe the
No,
highest
no,
is
yeah.
right after Soleimani, but still. Go on
What
though.
I sort of meant was I felt like the pressure was finally going to get them to cave. Not that the tensions were low. I phrased that poorly. That the escalation of tensions and this sort of long-standing hyperinflation and everything that they were creating in Iran through the sanctions and stuff, that would eventually gotten them. Because the issue with, so here's the issue with Iran. After the Iran nuclear deal with Obama, and again, this came from the Israelis and this came from our intelligence agencies, so there's cause for questions about it, but they said they kept their nuclear program going against the protocol.
But international inspectors said that they were following the JCPOA. So like I understand that like there were people that maybe don't have an
Is the
interest in.
JCPOA the official title for the
I think
Iran
that's
nuclear
I
deal?
think that's what it's called. Yeah, the JCPOA.
Okay.
We'll call it the Iran deal. Yeah, the Iran deal. International inspectors said that they were following the deal.
So,
Um,
so there was a criticism of the deal that they were not allowed to inspect military sites, which seems like a self-evident sort of loophole in the deal. Um, and again, that's just my understanding of the deal, that there was limited inspection. So yeah, they kept up with the standards, but that doesn't mean that the standards were necessarily up to par. There was an assumption continuously under Obama that because he was, and I'm not saying he wasn't, I'm saying he was a brilliant, well-articulated, well-educated man, that whatever he did must have been well thought out, and there couldn't be mistakes made in this sort of a way. And this is one of those examples where once I started listening and I looked into it and I realized that there was this seemingly this gaping hole in the agreement. First off, like on that side, that's an issue. And then once Trump did everything he did, started sanctioning Iran, and Iran started running out of extra money, a bunch of Al Qaeda and a bunch of other terrorist groups in the region that our intelligence agencies say Iran supports ran out of money and could
so
not keep their payroll and stuff going. And I was like, well,
I
that
think that
seems like
there
evidence that
is
this is happening.
so there is super good reason to believe that that is. I know Pompeo made claims like that. There is like really good reason to believe that those reports were like complete nonsense because Iran is a Shia. That's what they are, and like Al Qaeda and ISIS, those are Sunni Muslim. Very opposition. Like, I mean, that was one of the things about Soleimani. Soleimani had fought ISIS in like a number of different occasions, and so like I never really bought this idea. Now maybe there were other groups that you're referring to that potentially lost, like maybe like Hezbollah or something. But I don't think that there's any weight to the idea that Al Qaeda was losing its funding when Iran was getting sanctioned, just
Is Al
because like
Qaeda tied to Pakistan more so than Iran
I think Al
or
Qaeda. Yeah, you can make
Iran?
a good case. Yeah, you can make a much closer case that Al Qaeda is closer to Pakistan.
Can you
Um,
break that? I still have not had a good example or a good explanation of the Shiite or the Shia. Sorry, I won't even say it correctly. But the two factions
Shia.
in Islam that you're talking about, please say them
Yeah.
again so I can try to remember.
Oh,
The Sunni,
Shia and Sunni. Uh,
Shia and Sunni.
so
Okay.
Shia, that's that's like Iran. Iran is probably the most well known, Shia, and then like Saudi Arabia, for example, is Sunni, Sunni Muslim, and then like from Sunni, that's where you have like Wahhabism, and like Wahhabism is generally what you think of when you think about Al Qaeda and stuff like that, and that's like a very extreme, because like a regular Muslim could be Sunni or Shia, like that's just like the two like main branches, and then from there you can have more extremist stuff in there. But anyway, the only point I was getting at there is I never bought the idea that Al Qaeda was tied to Iran because of that. And obviously there's ties with like Hamas and Hezbollah, which
Yeah.
have their own
I might
problems.
be confusing the reporting there on which
Yeah, of course.
organizations were running out of money.
Yeah,
I think you're right. I think it was Hezbollah, but and
but
Hezbollah is operating in Palestine, right?
Hezbollah
Primarily.
is Lebanon, and then Hamas
Oh,
is Palestine.
Hamas. Okay. See,
Yeah,
yes, there's so many of these
it's
to try to keep
there's all
track.
the H's because there's the Houthis in Yemen too. So there's all
Yeah.
those. But I was gonna ask you because I want to interest this. So I don't know the best way of phrasing this. So I just want your opinion on this. So the basic
Feel free to
principle that
risk offending me. There's never
no
ever a concern there.
no, it's not like that. But I guess when we were talking back to the Iran deal, I want to take a step back and like, what do you feel is the U.S.'s role in determining whether or not a country like Iran should even have a nuclear weapon? You know what I mean? Do you feel like it's the right of the U.S. to be like, hey, you guys shouldn't have nukes? When we have nukes, we've supported other countries that have nukes. Like, what is your stance on that, or do you think that we should be moving towards like a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East? Like, where is your stance on that with other countries developing nukes and stuff?
So it's very much a before and after game. After they have a nuclear weapon, then we kind of have to treat them like a nuclear capable, not superpower, but a power. There's um, so there's sort of the before and after game, and then there's also a question of what is their view towards us? What is the threat from that nation to us? If you have a country like Iran that is funding certain groups that are against the United States or that are willing to commit terrorist actions against us, and then they get a nuclear weapon, obviously there's an automatic threat or concern of a terrorist-related nuclear attack. So um, when you have countries that are in that sort of an unstable position, North Korea might be an example. I don't think North Korea would launch an attack because it would just wipe them out very quickly, but when you have someone who is potentially capable of aggression and they don't have a nuclear weapon yet, I'm a believer in. I jumped around a little bit. We'll just take a step back. Broader foreign policy views for me is the carrot and the stick economically to try to get people to come over to our way of thinking. We'll give you a lucrative trade deal, remove all sanctions, and even start getting whatever, like the engineering core of the military to come start doing infrastructure, try to get like charity or welfare medicine packages or
Like
something,
like a positive
foreign
reinforcement kind
aid.
of thing.
Yeah, yeah. And then on the stick side of it is if you're doing things, and I would include Saudi Arabia in this, I would include China in this, and I would include Pakistan to a lesser degree in this. Definitely North Korea and definitely Iran. If you are a threat to us, our enemy, or working against us in some way, we should insulate you from the Western economies and Western capitalism, and make it so that we can't make it so that you're not as wealthy, because any criminal organization or any evil country that is wealthier is more of a threat. And if you don't have modern industry, you can't really compete in a modern industrial war. You just don't have the money or the scale. So there's this stick side of it where we're kind of trying to neutralize you as a threat through economics. And then there's the carrot where we want to reward you for good behavior and bring you into a better way of doing things. So I want that to sort of always be operating. And then there's this nuclear question, and it almost gets more serious. in that scenario where if they don't have a nuclear weapon, if they did get a nuclear weapon, it would be a threat to us. We need to come down hard with the sanctions until they agree to a real deal that will prevent that threat from coming up. Now, should another country have the inherent right to have a nuclear weapon, or if they can develop it themselves, should they have the free reign to do so? Um, it really is like a yes, but then if they're a threat to us or a threat to the world, no. And when you have a scenario where with each new country that gains nuclear power, the risk of nuclear activity militarily increases, it's sort of a let's try to reverse the nuclear trend and sort of what you're talking about, denuclearize things as best as we can instead of getting more of these types of things out there. Because the more of them are out there, the more that are in black markets, the more that are, potentially going to get in the hands of criminal organizations of any kind. I don't care if it's the cartels or if it's the Taliban or whoever. Um, that obviously is a threat, I think, in general to the world and something we should be working against. But um, I do recognize that, like, saying a country can't have the strong enough, like, a country having a good, strong defensive military and having nuclear capabilities to defend themselves is what we do.
Yeah.
So I can't be like, well, no, you can't do it, but we can do it, and it's fine. Like I think that is kind of a crappy argument. But when there's a real threat, I feel like we have to take action against that threat. I think that's the easiest way to sum it up.
Well, so let me pose this to you then. So, there has been talk before of establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. And there have been countries that have supported it. I believe Egypt has supported this in the past. And there's a number of countries, and in the past, I believe Iran has even shown some tepid support for it. But the main obstacle standing in the way of that happening is, of course, Israel, because Israel has the world's biggest open secret. Israel has nuclear weapons, but we don't acknowledge it. Like the U.S. doesn't officially recognize that Israel has nuclear weapons, and a lot of it has to do with the Stymington Amendment or something like that, which is where you can't give nuclear. It's U.S. law that you can't give military aid, or I think maybe even foreign aid to nuclear powers, to places that develop nuclear weapons outside of like the sanctioned way of doing it, and so. I feel like that's one of the biggest obstacles to getting to, because I think that we should move towards worldwide nuclear disarmament. I'd like to see a world without nuclear weapons. I think Japan is leading the way on that, for obvious reasons why they're very against nuclear weapons. And so I guess I want to do you and that's so how I wanted to tie this back in is that I think that Trump was a very big break from what you're describing, this whole carrot and stick philosophy, where I think that Trump, instead of trying to fix problems with the Iran deal, he just said, let's pull out of it and then sanction you guys, and then just almost through force try to hopefully, I think most people say that the sanctions are to try and spur some sort of regime change. I think it's pretty clear that there are people in the Trump administration that wanted regime change in Iran. And so how do you connect that with your philosophy being, in my opinion, very different than what Trump's was foreign policy wise?
I love the question. Really, this is a lot of fun. I really like doing this.
Yeah.
So, I um, I would push back a little bit because I think Trump participated in a lot of the carrot and stick thing I'm talking about with Venezuela and with Iran and North Korea and ramping up sanctions. But
explain that. Maybe use Venezuela, to get off Iran for a second. Explain with Venezuela, how do you feel like he embodied what you were describing with the carrot and stick?
Yeah. So there was a sort of their version of a constitutional convention. There was an emergency meeting to declare a new president in Venezuela, and it was I think his last name was Galindo or something like that. I can't remember, but he was the democratically elected leader of Venezuela. And then the previous guy who was the former sort of military lead that took over and was I can't remember his last name, but was the dictator and sort of the main guy in charge of Venezuela, was trying to find him, was threatening him. And so in an attempt to sort of punish them for that, I guess, or to push back against that regime, weaken that regime in general. they did this, but I do think I've only got 15 seconds before the 1 hour limit on Instagram cuts out, so we'll just have
Oh
to
gosh.
drop off and
Okay.
hop right back on. So
Okay.
we'll just do that, and then I'll finish my answer.
I see.